Thank you all for hanging around and finding our little corner of breaking convention here. We're going to change gears a bit now. I think we're going to maybe downshift from the literary to the journalistic. It's all literature in a way, I guess, right? Not just any journalism, but psychedelic journalism. I started calling myself a psychedelic journalist in the last few years. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but maybe we'll figure it out here together. My new book, I've written 6 books. My new book is called Changing Our Minds, Psychedelic Sacraments and the New Psychotherapy. And it's the culmination of about 3 years of research, reporting, and personal exploration into both this scientific medical renaissance into psychedelic drugs and also the spiritual exploration that so many people are going through. And, but in a way, it's really more than 3 years. In a way, this is really the culmination of about 50 years of personal exploration into exploring these substances, but with about a 25-year gap, roughly the same period when all the research shut down after the war on some drugs in the 1980s. I kind of stopped my psychedelic experimentation for quite a while. So it kind of mirrored that, they call it the lull in the psychedelic research, the history of psychedelic research. So in this book, I write about my my journalistic reporting and my personal experiences in various therapeutic and shamanic sessions involving MDMA, psilocybin, ketamine, 5-MeO-DMT, the toad medicine, which was in a way the wildest ride I think I went on, ayahuasca. And I tried to take these substances not as I used to as a recreational user, but in the context of the therapeutic context or the spiritual shamanic setting, as close as I could get to mirroring that. Now, I wasn't a subject in the official clinical trials that were going on, but through various means, I was able to work with some people and recreate that experience. So I personally experienced this stuff myself. And my book didn't start out with this intention, but it kind of became a personal search to find an alternative treatment for my own melancholy moods, my own depression. And it kind of accidentally unfolded that way a bit. But as part of that journey, I went to all over the place. I went to a Mexican ibogaine clinic in Baja, California. I went to a high-tech neuroscience lab in Switzerland, an ayahuasca retreat in the Brazilian jungle, psychedelic sessions with 2 crusading ketamine doctors, and last but not least, sort of a cathartic encounter with an underground mushroom therapist on the California coast. So it's been quite an interesting project, to say the least. But for the most part, despite having just said that, the book is really not about my trip. It's not mostly about me. I'm sort of old school journalist where I was a dirty word. Like the story's not about you, you don't write about yourself. Now that's kind of changed today. But so I really try to tell the human stories of the people who are actually doing this research and this spiritual exploration now. The research subjects, the therapists, the neuroscientists, but really the human side of this, their story is what I really try to tell in this new book. And a lot of it is about the clinical trials that are going on in the US, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, sponsored by MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and the Hefter Research Institute. But I also am looking at how other people, just ordinary, most of those research subjects have some diagnosis. They are depressed, they have PTSD. I'm also looking at how ordinary people are looking to bring the psychedelic experience into their lives in safe and sane ways, bring a little psychedelic consciousness into their everyday lives. As you may have figured out, the Changing Our Minds is about, sort of a bit of wordplay here. I think we can, these substances can help us change our consciousness. They're not magic bullets by any means, or just show us another way to be. We have to, of course, learn to live that way. So that's the Changing Our Minds, but it's also about how the public's ideas about this are changing in the media and the government and universities. There's a changing of minds about whether there are medically beneficial uses for these substances. So I mentioned I've written 6 books. The last 3 were largely about the history of psychedelic research and the current scene and future prospects. I mentioned that I've really written, well, my last 3 books are kind of an unholy trilogy. about psychedelic work. This was the first book I wrote in that series, called The Harvard Psychedelic Club. And it's the story of how Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, the man who would become Ram Dass, Andrew Weil, and Houston Smith crossed paths at Harvard in the fall of 1960, which is a fascinating period. And it kind of tells their story as a group biography. And it's kind of a social history of the psychedelic 60s. Oops. Here we go. I threw this slide is a little fuzzy in more ways than one. But I threw this in because it shows what a difference a decade can make. This is Richard Alpert in the beginning of the 1960s. This is Richard Alpert, Ram Dass, at the end of the 1960s. I mean, that picture kind of says it all about what happened in the 60s. Here's another picture of Timothy Leary. Not quite as dramatic of a transformation. This is Leary in the early 60s, and this is Leary at the Human Bee. I'm from San Francisco. This is Leary at the Human Bee in 1967. There's only about 3 or 4 years between these two pictures. This is he was stoned on about 300 micrograms of acid, addressing the crowd. He put the flower in his hair to hide his hearing aid. He was kind of embarrassed that he had a hearing aid, so that's what he put in there. This is January of 1967. There's been a lot of talk about the 50th anniversary of the Summer of Love. Actually, the real Summer of Love was in 1966, but the media didn't discover it then until 1967. So that's why we're doing the 50th anniversary now. Leary, let's see now. Well, I went ahead a little fast, but I mean, Leary was the self-described high priest of the psychedelic counterculture. And according to the conventional wisdom, it was the excesses of Leary and Alpert as professors and clinical psychologists at Harvard, getting kicked out of Harvard, which really kind of prompted this backlash against at least university research into these substances. Now, there is some truth to that, but we can't blame it all on Timothy Leary. But it is true that Richard Nixon famously called Timothy Leary the most dangerous man in America, to which Leary replied characteristically, "I'm not worried, I have America surrounded." So, but in the early years, they were pretty buttoned down. If you saw in the early 60s, they were coats and ties and all that. Meanwhile, out on the West Coast, we had Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters and the acid tests. This is an early poster from one of the acid tests. They were so stoned they didn't even know what year it was, 1960 question mark. But it was 66. And $2 included the Grateful Dead, and probably all the LSD you could handle. These are a couple pictures of the early acid tests, which I just stumbled across and wanted to throw them in by a guy, Gene Anthony, photographer in that era, who I ran into recently. He's still around. That's Kesey there during the acid tests. There's a shot of, so it was a little hipper out in the West Coast than it was at Harvard in the mid-1960s. So here, now look at that, and here's Richard Alpert. That same period. You see the difference? I mean, and people on the two coasts didn't know what the other was doing. It wasn't like now where everybody knows what's going on everywhere. It was a really different era. This is Ralph Metzner, who is still around, and he wrote The Psychedelic Experience with Leary and Alpert. He's hooked up to something they call the experiential typewriter, and he's high on DMT and typing in his impressions, and that's Alpert monitoring it there. So I mentioned that Harvard Psychedelic Club is the second book in this trilogy. The other one in this trilogy is called Distilled Spirits. And this was published by University of California Press in 2012, and it's kind of a prequel to the Harvard Psychedelic Club. I took the story back a generation to 3 other guys. I love this group biography format. It's the first time I did a book like that, and because it's a great way to sort of describe history through these lives that come together. These are 3 guys. 2 of them are Brits, Aldous Huxley in the upper right, Gerald Heard down here, who most of you probably haven't heard of, but he was very influential in laying the groundwork for what became the psychedelic counterculture of the 60s. He is the guy who got Huxley interested in religion, philosophy, and ultimately psychedelics. And that's Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. He's the third character in Distilled Spirits. And as some of you may have heard, maybe you don't know this, but Bill was really, he sobered up in the 30s, but in the 1950s, he started experimenting with LSD when it was still legal. And he thought it could be used to help alcoholics have the spiritual experience they talk about in the 12 steps, the spiritual awakening to overcome your addiction. And there's actually, I write about that in this book, there are logs of Bill Wilson's first acid trip in 1966, which are some funny lines. At first, one of the first things he says, people shouldn't take themselves so damn seriously. And then there's a log, like 237, it'll say, I have no more need for cigarettes. 410 asks for a cigarette. So that didn't work out too well. And this, the subtitle of this book is Getting High, Then Sober, with a famous writer, a forgotten philosopher, and a hopeless drunk. There's some cocaine right here in the picture and a razor blade. This book wound up becoming also partly a personal story, a memoir, a recovery memoir of my own addiction to alcohol and cocaine. I didn't know these guys, they're my grandfather's generation, but I wrote about how their stories helped me with my recovery as an addict and alcoholic. I'm 10 years clean and sober. But I do seem to have another addiction. It's not to psychedelics, it's to writing books about psychedelics. I can't seem to stop writing books. I'm trying to stop. I hope this is the last one. Is there a 12-step group you can join? Hi, my name is Don, and I'm still trying to figure out what happened in that acid trip back in 1972. I kind of feel like that's still going on. Okay, so, whoops. Oh yeah, I threw this in too, because this is George Harrison in San Francisco in the Summer of Love. And I just love that picture. And since, he came all the way from London to San Francisco, and I came from San Francisco to London, I threw that picture in. Harrison wasn't impressed with what was going on in the hate, actually, by then. This is me. The main reason I did that was to remind myself to go on a diet. But this is me in the 1970s. It's actually in London. I was a student at Berkeley. I was here studying my junior year abroad, my third year abroad. And the other reason I put this in there is I wanted to tell briefly a couple stories about how I used to take psychedelics and explain how that's different than how I'm talking about in this book. And this is what I looked like back then. And the story I'm going to tell you is from 1972. I was a first-year student at Cal. I had a new girlfriend named Julie. We took a little weekend trip down to Big Sur, beautiful coastal area, cliffs south of San Francisco. We took 250, 300 micrograms of acid, went out on a cliff. We melted together. We melted into Mother Earth. We saw God. I was convinced I'd found my soulmate. We would be together for the rest of our lives. We had discovered the meaning of life. After the trip, we'd melt together for like days, weeks. It was this wondrous thing. And then 2 months later, we had another LSD trip with another couple, and it was the bad trip from Central Casting. It was we thought we were going to a nature retreat. It turned out to be a hunting lodge. So there were gunshots going off as we were on the acid. I got into an argument with Julie. We split up, and it kicked off this period of my life where I didn't come down from that trip for 3, 4, 5 weeks. I was having flashbacks. I used to think flashbacks were anti-government propaganda. They don't really happen. LSD flashbacks, well, they do. They happen to me. And I tell that story because I regained my sanity, but I was scared to death. I thought I'd permanently damaged my brain, and I didn't know who to turn to. I kept it secret because I was afraid if anybody knew what was going on in my head, they would lock me up. They'd throw me in the loony bin, and they probably would have, which would have been the worst thing that could have happened to me. But therapists tell me that now. And I wish I had someone then who could help me work through. I wish I had someone back then, a therapist, a friend, a trusted guide, who could have helped me work through that and see that it wasn't a bad trip and a good trip. It was part of this whole thing, which I see now. But that's why this work is so important. That's why we really need to legalize this work to the extent that people can at least get help in understanding what's going on. I mentioned, or I think they mentioned in the, so a few years later, I wound up as a newspaper reporter. I've been a newspaper reporter most of my whole life. I took an early retirement about 10 years ago. I said I've been writing about LSD research for 40 years, which is a bit of a fib, but technically it's true, because this is a story from October of 1977. I was a sort of a 23-year-old cub reporter. This was my first big story in the Sunday newspaper, the horror of Army LSD tests. And this was about these stories that were just coming out in the 70s about all the stuff that was going on in the 50s, US Army and CIA doing research with LSD, horrific stuff. The guy who really wrote the book on this is Martin Lee, the book Acid Dreams. He was speaking here just earlier in the afternoon. That's one of the reasons that this research was shut down, not just because of Timothy Leary. There was horrible stuff that the US government was sponsoring, including torturing people on LSD, including their own soldiers as experiments. There was a plan to spray LSD on enemy troops as a kind of weapon of mass distraction. My favorite scheme was the CIA. This actually happened. The CIA set up a brothel, a whorehouse in San Francisco with LSD-laced swizzle sticks in the cocktails. So the Johns, the customers, would get high on acid and they would film them through two-way mirrors to see the effects of LSD. So unwittingly, these guys were getting these huge, getting dosed. I mean, this is the kind of thing that the US government sponsored. Let's see, where are we here? So just a few more stories about the old days. This is me at an MDA party. That's me with that beatific vision, vision there in the 1980s. And one of the reasons I wrote this book is I was at the memorial service for Sasha Shulgin. How many of you have heard of Sasha Shulgin? He was a chemist who helped popularize MDMA, invented a lot of psychedelics. He and Leo Zeff are the kind of the godfather of MDMA therapy. And I went to Sasha's a few years ago when I was doing the reporting for this. I went to Sasha's memorial service, and the Master of Ceremonies asked us to close our eyes and remember a time when we had a beautiful experience with one of the substances that Sasha had helped bring into the world. And I have a reason to think that Sasha might have had something to do with the MDA, not the MDMA, not the MDMA, but MDA, a similar drug that we were on in that. And these people I was with, I just had met them then, and they became my lifelong friends. I had a bond with these people that lasted for decades, long after we had stopped doing psychedelics. Oops. So those are the stories from the old days. This is what it looks like. This was MDA therapy in the 80s for me. This is how it looks today. This is a John. But I think the spirit in some ways is the same. This is the session rooms at Hopkins, where this is actually a staged photo, but it's what it looks like when they do it. It's the actual room. These are two therapists at Hopkins. This is someone filling in as a research subject on a study of cancer patients using psilocybin-assisted therapy to overcome their depression and anxiety. And so that's what it sort of looks like now. So how is what we were doing back then different than what I'm talking about and writing about in this book? Well, I think there are four major differences in my mind between these two approaches. The first one is the psychedelic exploration today is only done in the clinical trials I'm talking about, right, with research subjects. It's only done after medical and psychological screening. That's important. Two, it's done in a safe and secure setting with experienced, trusted guides. They're the guides that I wish I had back then. And even my good trip in 1972, we were still high on LSD when we got back in our car. We're driving on this winding coastal road in the fog. We could have killed ourselves, We didn't think about that stuff back then. But it was not exactly, even the good trip was not exactly the wise use of an entheogen. And the third thing is in a clinical trial or in a session with a trusted guide, whether it's a clinical trial or an underground therapist you can trust, you know exactly what you're ingesting. You know the dose of what you're ingesting. And that's so important. When you take drugs on the street, you're playing Russian roulette, which is one reason I don't do it anymore. And the fourth difference is after a guided session, the psychedelic explorer meets with a therapist or gets suggestions from his guide about how to integrate these insights into their real lives. This is not just about altered states of consciousness. It's about altered traits of human behavior. Altered states versus altered traits. That's a line from Houston Smith, who is one of the guys I wrote about in Distilled Spirits. And that's really where the rubber hits the road. I mean, do these trips, do these experiences that we have, are they making us more aware, kinder, gentler, more compassionate people? How are we treating our wife or our husband? Is it changing that? And so in my somewhat informed opinion, I think the most important thing to say about this is that psychedelic session work, it's really not about the drug. It's about the insight and the experience people have on the drug. That's why in some ways all these clinical trials are a little off. They're testing these drugs in a way that they test regular drugs, but they have to do that to jump through all the hoops and get these drugs decriminalized. But these substances really are different. Psychedelics are not inherently good or bad. Charlie Manson gave LSD to his girls, as he called them, and they went out and murdered people. These drugs are not inherently good. They're tools, and intention is the key. So briefly, let me just turn to a few of the research subjects that I write about. So more than half the chapters in Changing Our Minds are about these clinical trials. And this is not just your typical therapy where it's your 50-minute hour with your therapist. That's all the time we have. We'll see you next week. I mean, these sessions go on for 6-7 hours. And so the next slide. This is Annie and Michael Mithover, who are in South Carolina, and they're like sort of the power couple of MDMA-assisted therapy in the US, mostly for post-traumatic stress disorder. They have led more than 150 government-approved sessions with war veterans, a lot of US war veterans, rape victims, and others suffering from post-traumatic stress. And I wanted to just read a quick quote from Michael about why he thinks MDMA works in a therapeutic context. He says, this is Michael here, he says, it helps them to revisit the trauma in a therapeutic way that is not emotionally overwhelming or emotionally numbing. If people are flooded with anxiety and emotion, they can't quite process the trauma. The same is true if they are emotionally numb. The MDMA seems to bring them into that middle range, which some have called the optimum arousal zone for therapy. And I think that to me, that was a really good explanation of really how this stuff works in a therapeutic setting. The first chapter of my book is titled Wounded Warrior. It's a very detailed, in some ways gruesomely detailed account of what happened to this guy here, Nigel McCurry, who was a US soldier in Iraq in the beginning of the Iraq War, one of them still going on, one of the most misguided misadventures in the history of my country. Anyway, so this is Nigel in Iraq. You can see the expression on his face. I don't have time to go into the details, but he had a horrific experience, including accidentally murdering these two young Iraqi girls at a firefight and dealing with the stress from that. That's Nigel in Iraq. Now this isn't working, but that's okay. We don't need the slides. I'm almost. Oh, just that arrow? Okay, there we go. This is Nigel after. So this is him after his therapy, looking a little more mellow than in the previous picture. Let me just read you one quote from Nigel, the guy himself, the subject himself, about why he thinks MDMA helped him. It prepares the brain to have a healing experience. When I was on the MDMA, I felt for the first time like I was able to clearly see the individual components that were working together to create PTSD. Before, it seemed like this jumbled up mess of psychological junk I couldn't work through. It was like MDMA gave me an aerial view of the terrain. Yeah, and I thought that was a great description of how this really works. I don't want to go over, so let me just briefly go through. This is Roland Griffith, who is doing the work with MDMA and his nice little mushroom sculpture there at Johns Hopkins University. That's one of the research subjects. This is Franz Vollenweider in Switzerland. I spent a few days with him at his lab. He's done more of the neuroscience work. There's a chapter on the neuroscience in my book, which mostly features Franz and Katrin Preller, one of his associates there. I mentioned that I went to Brazil. And this is me here in an all-night, at the end of the morning after an all-night ayahuasca ceremony, which I don't have time to go into. I tell the story in the book. It was a very powerful experience and a healing experience for me. You're in the middle of the jungle. You hear the sounds of the jungle and the music, the songs in Portuguese that they're playing all night and singing along. He's not really a shaman. He sort of reminded me of a Brazilian Jerry Garcia, actually. A great musician, though, and the music was just fantastic during this all-night ceremony, and it really was as important as the medicine itself, I think. I had an experience on the. How much time do I have? Okay. I can't get into it, but I had an experience of taking a tour of my own mind, walking through my own brain on MDMA, and getting to a point where my addict brain was talking to my higher power brain, and I was just there listening to this conversation. The higher power brain is like, why do you always want more? What is it about this? More. You never experience, and then meanwhile they're singing the song in the back where the word was amor, but I turned it into more, amor, not more. Love is what I need, not more drugs, not more stuff. It's love, amor, not more. And it's a little thing, but when you're on these substances and you remember that, it really helped me understand my own addictive tendencies. And I just saw that. This was a Newsweek photo I saw much later, but it kind of looked like that a little bit. These are the mushrooms I took with an underground mushroom therapist. I took actually a lot more than that. She said I said I wanted a full-blown mystical experience, so she said, I'm going to give you what Terence McKenna called the heroic dose. So be careful what you ask for. But I tell that story in the epilogue of the book. And it's in conclusion, let me just say that these drugs are not for everyone. They're probably not for most people, and I'm not recommending that anyone else take them. And I'm not just saying that as a legal disclaimer. I mean, I really mean it. But for me, these medicines help me find a way to cultivate compassion and connection, to help me remember how my life has meaning, how it all fits together, especially my work with the ketamine, which I write about in the book, in a therapeutic context, which is really the opposite of depression. But with depression, you forget how things fit together, why things have meaning, and that's how it really helped me. So I'm still, working on making that leap from altered states to altered traits, but hopefully we have a few years to work on that together. So thank you for your kind attention.